Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I hope all of you are doing well. Today, I want to present to you what I consider to be a special video. And I think when anyone walks away from listening to this video in its entirety, you'll see nothing short of an absolute takedown of an individual's personal worldview, that of Darth Dawkins, also known as Evolution False or Duncan Atheism. His actual name is Gary F. Milne, and this video is aimed at exposing the internal inconsistencies of his worldview. Why would it be important to do this? Well, in a few minutes, you'll hear from both Gary and also hear from one of his philosophical idols, PhD Greg Benson, and they will both explain why this is so relevant to the discussion. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, what I am now going to let you hear is conversation that took place where Gary is speaking, and I decided to use this clip up front and as an extremely important starting point for the purpose of this video, as we can take what he says in this conversation and from here connect the dots. When you listen to this conversation by connecting the dots or connecting statements he makes in this dialogue to other similar statements he makes elsewhere, each dot begins to form a picture. If we are only looking at one dot isolated by itself, it may not be complete. But as we go along in this video, I'm sure that by the end, you'll see the entire picture very completely and clearly. This clip is extremely relevant and in context to his general dialogue. Here's the clip.
But it fails.
Okay, no, that all makes sense to me. For an eternal being, I think that all logically made sense to me. So where this is probably just a question you get asked a lot, but from where does it go from? That's essentially logically proving God, but from there to linking it to the Christian God.
Oh, okay. So I'm not arguing for a generic God. That God is a perfect God. He has how shall I put this? That God is perfect is inferred by God's ordination, because if the eternal were not perfect, then there wouldn't be grounds for truth, reason, and intelligibility. You wouldn't have any contextualization. If the eternal was not perfect, meaning having all great-making properties, which the God of the Bible has, then you wouldn't have a ground of all being that would have the necessary attributes to secure truth, reason, and intelligibility. Okay. So even some guy in the Amazonian jungle knows by virtue of God's creation that God exists and that God is perfect. Okay, and then we further know this in specificity through the prophets, ultimately in Jesus Christ and the Christian scriptures, as to God's nature. The transcendental argument for God is not a generic argument for God. It's specifically referring to the Christian God.
Right. Okay.
Any other God that's put on the table that is not constitutive of being perfect and having the attribute set of the Christian God is a God that cannot fill the bill.
Yeah, that cannot fit in line with the eternal. Yeah, I get that. Yeah. So what? This is just a literal what if, valueless thing. But what if the Christian God was just a God claiming to have those characteristics and didn't necessarily have those characteristics?
Well, there's two worldviews. There's the God worldview, where God constitutes being perfect, the Christian God, and all other worldviews. Okay, where it would be not the Christian God.
Okay. Could I rephrase it then? So, yes. I guess technically the Christian God conceptually would be this eternal, all perfect being, but I'm saying specifically the deity of the Bible that these entities and that these people were interacting with. Is it possible that could not have been this eternal being and just another non-physical entity?
the character set of God, okay, must be perfect, as in a Christian God. That way, that's the only way that it can be exclusive and indispensable. Okay.
Okay.
That's how you can know that it is a Christian God, because what God has revealed about Himself through creation and through the Christian scriptures, when we look at that character set compositely, that it's indispensable and it's exclusive. No other God can have it. Now, some people naively, like I just talked with a professor of philosophy who I debated with 2 days in a row, and he thought that he could make an appeal to the Islamic God or other gods, and he found out very quickly, and much to his chagrin, that you can't do that. It fails miserably. So okay, so let's put it this way. God as the eternal, the ground of all being, right? I'm trying to figure out how to say this properly.
No, I do get
what he reveals about himself is indispensable. His character set is indispensable in that if you disregard it, you won't have an identifiable and defensible ultimate starting point and reference point to contextualize anything. Okay? In other words, unless everything is contextualized by God being perfect and being the ultimate starting point and reference point for what anything is, then you don't have metaphysical grounds for human intelligibility.
Okay.
Okay, so now I remember what I wanted to tell you. All right? When God reveals Himself, He has to reveal Himself in a way that is self-attesting and self-authenticating, right? And being that we're not omniscient, the way that He does that is the character traits that He reveals implicitly through creation and directly through the scriptures means that His character set is self-attesting. It's self-attesting because not only from its source, but it's indispensable. You can't do without it. If you attempt to deny that God possesses that attribute set and that He's revealed it, God would have to exist even for you to.
Hello?
What's the contextualization for God exactly?
Okay, contextualization is by virtue of that which is not eternal and perfect. God Himself is internally contextualized. Now, if you want to argue that there is something else that can be internally contextualized, and that it will possess aseity, that it will be self-contained, unconditionally non-dependent, and non-derivative, good luck doing that. Okay? This is not to say everything metaphysically has to be contextualized, because then that would include God. Okay? God being the absolute, okay? He's self-contained. He requires no contextualization. Okay?
What reason do you have to believe that what was written in the Bible, what like God's word says that, men can't be women and women can't be men? What reason do you have to believe that?
What reason do I have to believe that? Well, I believe that in virtue of the fact that God has taken the initiative to reveal Himself both in natural and special revelation. The Bible constitutes special revelation, that the truths therein indicate what is necessary for the metaphysical foundational preconditions of human intelligibility. That would have to be that there is something absolute, ultimate, meaning is the source of all possibility and impossibility. And I said absolute, which means immutable, and then it would have to be a mind, and then institute this world that is instituting and securing regularities so that we could have intelligibility about any propositional truths. Because without that fundamental foundation, the character and property set that I have just given you briefly, and I can expand on that later, that the property and character set of God, including His creator and being sovereign over it, and it is according to His plan. Apart from that, you won't be able to defend the intelligibility of any statement about anything at all, because you won't have any metaphysical background information to support it. And so the Bible directly, and we have an obligation to acknowledge that which is ultimate, God. Otherwise, we will be insanely acknowledging our own autonomy, which would be insane. And if we acknowledge our own autonomy as opposed to God's mind is autonomous, then when we embrace autonomous reasoning, it will therefore result in various insane lines of reasoning.
So, to sum up that conversation, Gary mentioned a few key points. He said that the biblical God is perfect in that he possesses all necessary, indispensable qualities and or attributes. These attributes make up an entire, all-inclusive attribute set, and none of them, not even one, can be dispensed or eliminated. And for the character set to lack even one of these attributes will destroy one's intelligibility, and without, no one will be able to contextualize anything. Only the biblical Christian God can fulfill and possess this character set in their entirety. Now, there are times when Gary will be asked, what are these attributes that make up this character set? Gary basically repeats the same qualities individually and respectively, but he generally does not remain consistent in including all of them in every instance where he is asked to name them one by one. In some cases, he gives a variation that may be slightly different. The important thing to identify here is, are there any cases where he contradicts himself by mentioning any specific attribute that, according to other statements he has made, does not or cannot be included in the set? If Gary either implicitly or explicitly includes an attribute that does not belong in the set, according to Gary's own position, framework, or worldview, then Gary is either contradicting himself, or he is being inconsistent, or is doing both. I would say that now would be a good time to, for lack of a better word, to Mirandize Gary. In other words, if I were to have an actual dialogue with Gary, one of the primary and the first things out of my mouth would be to read him his Miranda, meaning that anything Gary says, either explicitly or implicitly, either intentionally or in error, anything he says or does will be fully taken advantage of and will be inverted using
There
a
is
180
one thing
and will
I
be
need to
used
point
against
out
him
about
with
myself.
the fullest force. Gary and everyone else online, they do not know whether I am a theist or an unbeliever. Why is this relative to the issue and to everything that follows? Their entire approach hinges on just one thing. Is the person they're speaking to a theist or not? Van Tillian apologetics is entirely strategy dependent. From the very beginning, their whole method changes depending on how you answer that one question. That being the case, I have made an intentional effort, strictly in my online presence, not to divulge this key information. Why do I intentionally do this? If you admit you're not a theist, they will typically make statements aimed at you, such as, you can't know anything, you can't justify logic, science, or morals. You're borrowing from the Christian worldview. You can't even justify something as simple as the sky is blue. Sound familiar? As a tournament-winning chess player, I don't give them the opening move that Van Til requires to execute the rest of the apologetics game, and just like that, their entire framework is neutralized. So, when I withhold that critical piece of information, all those prepackaged presuppositional apologetics cliches bounce off me, just like bullets off of Superman's chest. Okay, now, with those preliminaries out of the way, we can now get to the actual point of this video. Okay, what you are looking at now is a list I put together based off of what you just heard. This list has each and every attribute or property that Gary mentioned in the preceding clips. Now, at this point, an appropriate question might be, how does this list compare to a list of what Van Til would have considered as being God's core attributes? Do you think that Gary is on the same page as Van Til? Remember, along with PhD Greg Banson, Gary considers Cornelius Van Til as one of his philosophical heroes, and these are the two primary individuals that Gary holds and esteems, based on Gary exhaustively referencing and appealing to both as being held in the highest regard. Let's see how Gary's list might compare to Van Til's list, and here is that list. As you can immediately notice, right out of the gate, there is an obvious difference at face value between Gary's list on the left and Van Til's list on the right. The two lists may share a few similar items, but Gary's list is virtually double the amount on Van Til's list. One might stop and ask the immediate question, why is there such an obvious difference between the two? As we move along, we are going to see why this is the case. And I think that even the theists out there, including even theists that Gary speaks to on a fairly regular basis, or those he has spoken to multiple times in the past, are going to be both surprised and shocked at what they will be seeing. What I intend to do now is to take a look at Gary's basic conception of God, a fundamental view of what he holds to when he speaks about God. In the following clip, Gary was asked what would be his most foundational, fundamental belief in his entire worldview, and here is how he responded.
Sure. So what would you say is a core belief in Christianity?
Well, that there's an eternal creator who's created this world, and he's imposed that the world rationally, undeniably, he's made to be known to us, and that we are accountable to him. And he has a plan of creation and redemption.
And you would say this is the core belief?
I'm telling you what Christianity teaches.
Yeah, no, but I asked, like, I understand there's a lot of traditions and other beliefs. What I'm asking you is, what is the core? What is the soul? If you had to point, what is the most important / core / the very founding the foundation, the founding idea of Christianity, what would it be?
I was just explaining it to you.
Okay.
Another very important thing is based off of a statement Darth has made several times, as in the following clips.
God, from a biblical, I'm only going to give you the biblical perspective.
I want your perspective.
I'm giving you, my perspective is the biblical perspective.
Okay.
So the claim is that he only argues, speaks, or defends what he refers to as the Christian worldview. Why is this very important to mention from the very beginning? If Gary makes contradictory statements about the same issue, for example, affirming and denying a claim from within the Christian framework, he has, among other things, abandoned the principle of non-contradiction, which is not neutral, but grounded in God's nature. And therefore, he has undermined the claim that he is speaking from a consistently Christian epistemology. So even if Gary says he's speaking from the Christian worldview, he's not actually doing so if he affirms or makes contradictory propositions. Also very important to mention is the following.
One of the two great intellectual sins that men commit, no matter what field of study you're in, is arbitrariness. The other one is inconsistency. No one is allowed to be arbitrary if you're trying to present a rational basis for what you believe. And no one is being rational in presenting a basis for what they believe if they contradict themselves, if they're inconsistent.
That was Greg Banson, and he is one of very likely the two most influential figures in Gary's online education, and we'll get to that in a moment. The other individual is Cornelius Van Til. PhD Greg Banson was a student of Van Til's, and he ranked at the very top of the list, certainly in the top 3 of any and all of Van Til's students. As you heard, Banson said that there are, among others, 2 very important things to focus on when examining a worldview, and no one is immune from this. He said, we look for arbitrariness and inconsistency. As we go deeper into this discussion, this statement from Greg Banson will be very relevant when we look at Gary's statements, claims, and his theological position. Now, as far as Gary's education, let's listen as Gary explains this for us because this too is very relevant. And I also think that as we continue to go deeper, Gary's education and how he accomplished it will also become very revealing.
I'm not a philosophy grad student. I've never even gotten a BA in philosophy. Okay, whatever I know about philosophy, I've learned from reading on myself. And you're playing the...
Okay, now, does everybody hear
what
this?
Degree
This
do
is,
you have?
you know what, listen, Carlos.
Do you have a degree?
Listen, Carlos. Do I have
Do
a
you
degree?
have a degree,
No,
Doc?
no, I don't. If you have a PhD in mathematics...
Also, Gary has admitted that he does not speak either Greek, Hebrew, or Aramaic, and this will also have bearing to the direction we are headed.
In the original autographs is the infallible, inspired word of God, is the exact message down to the word that God intended.
Do you speak either ancient Hebrew or ancient Greek?
No.
Aramaic?
No.
So you've never read it in the original autograph. You just read it in.
No,
what's your preferred version? KJV, NIV?
New American Standard.
Why would this be important? Well, take a look at the following clips and you'll get an idea of Gary's, for lack of a better word, methodology when handling words. Gary may claim to be a conservative, but when you take a look at these clips, you'll see why bring this issue up will be of importance. Gary, in terms of his linguistic skills, has a talent for, not conservatively, but liberally, wanting to play both sides of the field. And the following example is far from being just an isolated incident. It's typical Gary F. Milne.
So you are factually incorrect. Allah is not sovereign. Okay, look up the English word sovereign. There's nothing to be sovereign over.
You're being dishonest.
No. Listen to me. You are completely dishonest. Okay, I've dealt with Catholics like you before, where you actually lie about these things. The word Petra, yes, you are lying because it does not mean the same thing as a small stone or rock. It means a rock edifice. It's not something that can be picked up or handled. It's a completely different Greek word.
You see, Darth, I'm just searching it now. I'm searching the translation of it from Greek to English. Okay? Are you listening?
It doesn't matter. The English is not authoritative. The Greek is.
Yeah, I am reading it.
In my late teens, I remember reading a book entitled The Kingdom of the Cults, written by the late Walter Martin. At that time, Martin was considered the world's foremost authority on cults. In his book, this is part of what he had to say about the language and vocabulary that cult members use. On countless occasions, the author has been asked, why is it that when I am talking with a cultist, he seems to be in full agreement with what I am saying, but when we have finished talking, I am aware of a definite lack of communication, almost as though we were not talking the same language? The answer to this question is, of course, that we have not been communicating because the vocabulary of the cults is not the vocabulary of the Bible by definition. Only the Lord knows how many fruitless hours have been spent attempting to confront cultists with the claim of the gospel, when 5 short minutes of insistence upon definitions of the terms employed in conversation, particularly concerning the nature of God and the person, nature, and work of Jesus Christ, would have stripped the cult theology of one of its most potent tools, that of theological term switching. Through the manipulation of terminology, it is therefore obvious that the cultist has the Christian at a distinct disadvantage, particularly in the realm of the great fundamental doctrines of biblical theology. The question then is, how can the interested Christians solve that problem, if indeed it can be solved at all? Martin also said that one could, for example, talk with a Jehovah's Witness. The Jehovah's Witness may say that they believe in Jesus, they believe in salvation, and they believe in God, but if their actual beliefs are studied in detail, their actual belief is quite different from the beliefs traditionally held by either mainstream or Orthodox Christianity. Unless particular words are flushed out and clearly defined, an actual two-way discussion could lead to a complete misunderstanding of their beliefs. And that is very relative to this entire discussion, because as you are about to see, we are going to run into some words that on the outside may appear to be Ventilian or presuppositional concepts, but when we look closer, we will see that it's definitely not the case. Next, I would like to give you some personal information about myself, which I generally do not do because I am a very private person. The following is from a video that I actually posted about 3 years ago, but I think it is relevant to this discussion. Here's the clip.
When I was 16 years old, I had an article published in an international magazine. Let's see, I guess one more thing. I have a series of books which are about to be published. There's a total of 15 in all. I will have that completed probably within the next week, maybe two. And they will be published and sold throughout Central America and parts of South America. My name will be on that book, or on those books, I should say.
Okay. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what I am going to be discussing in this video is something Ventil warned about, that a believer should be extremely careful of when discussing this subject. And the reason for this is due to the possibility that the unbeliever will begin to make unsupported or unwarranted statements about the Christian worldview, or make statements about concepts that do not appear anywhere in the Bible. The issue I am going to be discussing can be formed into a question as follows: what was the biblical God doing since creation or before creation? Once we examine this and see how Gary attempts to answer this and how he approaches this issue, we are going to see, to put it very mildly, some very strong philosophical and logical violations and grotesque blunders, inconsistencies, and contradictions that Gary repeatedly commits to. Ventil drew a strict line and warned believers not to cross that line and drift into speculation or unsupported metaphysical claims. As we will see, not only does Gary liberally cross over this line, but he is also both inconsistent and contradictory, and is therefore extremely irrational in his claims, statements, and his overall position when we compare it to both the Bible and what Ventil's framework actually says. In Ventil's presuppositional framework, the state of affairs sans creation, for example, prior to or apart from Genesis 1:1, when only God exists, is more fundamental, not less, than the state of affairs after creation. Ventil would say that the most fundamental state of affairs in the Christian worldview is the ontological Trinity, the tri-personal, self-existent, sovereign God who alone makes sense of reality, thought, and experience. Now, why would Ventil say that is the case? There's several reasons. For example, for Ventil, God is the ultimate and necessary being, whereas creation is contingent and derivative. God existed in perfect fullness and self-sufficiency before anything else existed. Therefore, the reality of God alone is more basic, logically and ontologically, than any state of affairs that includes creation. Genesis 1:1 introduces change in the created order, but God's essence, knowledge, and purpose remain unchanged. The state of affairs post-Genesis 1:1 is grounded in God's eternal decree, which itself exists within God prior to creation. In the next clips, you will hear as Gary explains that Adam already possessed intelligibility when he first opened his eyes, and that was the case in that God had providentially ordained this to take place. And you will also hear Gary explain why this attribute set was already in place prior to God creating Adam.
You believe that we can start without God's revelation? Everything that God created, you're starting with his revelation. Do you understand the Ventilian position that we're starting with God's revelation, and that not only includes special revelation, but our own personal consciousness is a revelation of God. When Adam opened up his eyes and he saw a rabbit running in front of him, that was a revelation of God. When he looked up and he saw the moon at night, that's a revelation of God. The position of that as well are both aspects of God's revelatory actions. When Adam opened up his eyes and he looked around, his ability simply to be a rational being itself was a revelatory action of God. We have a server called Kingdom of Debates, and we have no courageous atheists. Okay, so the way that I show the existence of God is I first want to show to atheists that atheism is just completely self-defeating and incoherent on its own terms. Then once I establish that, then I show them that the only possible worldview by which we can derive intelligibility and coherence is that we have to have a God who is fundamental, the source of all possibility. And that God has to have a specific character set. Because if that God doesn't have the character set, then consequently down the road after creation, we're not going to have the grounds for human intelligibility. And guess what? The God of the Bible is the only God in human history that has that specific property or character set, right? People say, well, how do you know that's the true God? Well, it's because there is no other God out there that either claims or could have that property set.
It's very important to point out that Gary would not only say that the Christian God is the only God that possesses this particular set of attributes, but he also says that this set of attributes in its entirety must be in place sans creation, and that the biblical God did have all of these attributes existing as inherent and indivisible attributes before creation took place. Gary gives a variation of what attributes compose this set, and he sometimes either omits one or more or adds one or more to his explanation. But again, the problem is not necessarily in either the omission or the addition of any given attribute. The problem is if he includes an attribute that contradicts his overall position. Here are a couple clips where Gary was asked to give a breakdown on the attributes that make up this great making property and or essential property set.
So God revealed it, but then we look at further the content of what he has revealed about himself. He reveals what his character and nature is, what his attributes are as creator. If we remove, if we try to imitate the Christian God by providing an alternative, if we fiddle around with God's attributes, like we remove his omniscience or omnipotence, or that he is the Savior and he has an unfolding plan of salvation, or we decide that we want a Unitarian God rather than a Trinitarian God, the removal or tampering with any of the properties that God has revealed are all gathered together in his necessary being for actuality and intelligibility, then it destroys intelligibility. Okay? Like for example, we have the Islamic God, or like the God of Jehovah's Witnesses, where they present a Unitarian God, and they say, oh, well, your belief in the Trinitarian God is false, and our God is true. Well, I just simply point out, well, what we then have is an autistic God in eternity past who is incapacitated to relate, right? I was explaining to a Muslim today that autism is to varying degrees an incapacity to actualize relationalness, right? Okay. And he agreed with that. And I don't think anybody would agree with this definition. Well, the Islamic God and Unitarian gods have no capacity to actualize relationality in eternity past. There's no one to relate to. But the God of the Bible, who is true, has revealed he is one God, one being, one essence, but he is a plurality of persons. Each of the persons can relate to another person in the Godhead in context within the third.
It could be, yeah, it could be.
Okay, good, but the Islamic God is the greatest of all deceivers. So, but when you say the sky, so when you are testifying the sky is blue, maybe the greatest of all deceivers, which is what the Islamic God says about himself, is deceiving you. And wait a minute, all right? And that Jesus never died on the cross because Allah made it to appear that Jesus died on the cross. You see, what you're not understanding is the Christian God has a unique set of properties and attributes. Deny any of those attributes and you won't have grounds for human intelligibility. Okay? If you suppose he says, oh, well, I believe in God and I think Jesus was his prophet, I just don't believe in the Trinity. If you deny God's triune nature, you will destroy your ability to be intelligible, because then I'm going to say, good, is your God a monad? So then how does creation reflect the characteristics of your God? He's an absolute one. Why don't we see an absolute one in creation? Because we have a one in the many in the Creator, we can reflectively in creation have a one in the many where there's unity and diversity. Allah does not have the property set to provide ontologically or on a metaphysical scale human intelligibility. Okay? When Allah is the greatest of all deceivers, you don't have a basis for human intelligibility.
Can you repeat that? How Allah doesn't have a...
Okay. Human intelligibility is going to depend and derive in terms of what is ultimate. And that which is ultimate has to have a specific property or character set. And it has to include that what is ultimate is absolute, unconditionally non-dependent, omniscient, omnipotent, always truth-revealing, triune, meaning God is three persons and one being, that he's providential, revelational, and he has an unfolding salvific plan to deal with the current problem that humanity is facing.
I said the teleology, the mechanism by which he does it, is irrelevant. It's just that he does it, and we apprehend the fact that he has the revelatory power.
Well, God has revealed himself through all facts, not just some facts. All facts indicate that there's one true creator. And if there are indeed facts, then from that it follows that that creator is going to have the attribute set that we know about through special revelation. Because if you deny one or more of the properties that the God of the Bible has, right, then you're not going to be able to have human intelligibility. The God of the Bible's property set is omniscience, omnipotence, always truth-revealing, sovereignty, providence, and his salvific program that he is unveiling throughout human history. And his triune nature. Without this attribute set, there cannot be human intelligibility. And no other God that has ever been presented even attempts to have that attribute set. Not even the God of Islam. Okay.
Okay, folks, now if you will remember in the earlier part of this video, Gary was asked what his most foundational, fundamental core belief would be, and he replied by saying that he has a belief in the existence of an eternal creator God. Since this is his most foundational, fundamental belief, what we are now going to zero in on is
But when we take a look at Gary's usage, we see quite a shift take place.
And when we zero in and focus on this shift, how he personally uses, or better misuses, these words, and more importantly, the motive, intent, and objective for why he deviates from all of the above, the results will become very revealing. And even according to Gary F. Milne himself, by his own claims, statements, and arguments, we are going to clearly see Gary's position become self-destructive and an enemy unto itself.
You completely ignored the fact that you were entirely evasive during the entire interaction on modern day debate. I'll demonstrate it right now. We'll see how evasive you are. Cool. Can you please tell me how it is there is no eternal creator God? Or you believe that there is not an ultimate eternal creator God? In that, okay, now, well, here's the problem, okay? You are saying that an eternal creator God does not exist, and that is to communicate to mankind so that they can know that there is an eternal creator who created all things, to atheism. So how is it that there is no eternal creator God?
Let me rephrase the question. Do you believe there's an eternal creator who has instituted all the particularity of creation, and he said it to visionary cliche, you're doing it again? I didn't ask you what you know. I said, do you believe that there is an eternal creator God? how God is defined within the conversation. God is defined as the supreme being who is the eternal creator of all things that are not himself. That all the facts that you are acquainted with exist with independence from God as eternal creator?
Okay, then. So after listening to that montage, I bet there are a lot of listeners, especially the theists out there, who may be scratching their heads and asking themselves just exactly what is the problem here? Or why is Darth Dawkins Debunked making a big deal out of this? And now comes the moment of showing the man behind the curtain, so to speak. You see, ladies and gentlemen, when Gary uses that word eternal, I could even grant that in most instances he is using that word correctly. Also, whenever Gary uses that word creator, again, I could grant that he uses the word correctly. But when he uses the words eternal creator God, this is where the magic begins. In that case, Gary definitely is not actually referring to an eternal creator God. Instead, in Gary's worldview, God is not the eternal creator, and God does not become eternal creator until time itself begins at Genesis 1. I am sure that if you have listened to Gary for more than even 1 month, and probably less, you will hear him speak about something being the precondition to or for something else. In this case, Gary actually adds a precondition to the God of the Holy Christian Scriptures. Listen as Gary explains his rationale for why he is doing this, and I am sure that when some of you listen to what follows, especially some of you theists, you will consider the following to be an extremely radically bizarre and, to put it very mildly, a very alarming piece of information to unfold.
To be creator. No, you don't. See, this is a perfect example of sophistry. Now, in a theistic worldview, okay, God only possesses the attribute of creator after he has instantiated creation. Logically, prior to bringing in creation, he's not the creator. You don't know what you are talking about. Logically prior, listen carefully to my question. Logically prior to creation, what was God creator of?
That doesn't negate that he is a creator.
Okay, that's not an answer to my question, dum-dum.
He didn't create anything, but that doesn't negate his ability to create.
Listen to me. This is why I don't like talking with teenage Muslims.
Yeah, that's why I don't like talking to you.
Listen to me carefully. Logically prior to creation, before there was a creation, okay, logically prior, okay, what was God creator of?
God didn't create anything yet.
Okay, so he wasn't creator.
Do you know what that means?
Yeah, it means that one is the source of something else.
Oh, it means that that person possesses the ability to.
No, no, sir. You are. Listen to me. No, sir. This is pure sophistry. What you were invoking. Okay, overtalk me again, and I will gag you. Okay. Now, you are confusing being a creator with. All right, have it your way. Okay. You are confusing God's ability to be omnipotent, okay, to be powerful, okay, with him actually exercising that. Okay? So God being powerful, meaning the capacity to do things if he so chose to do so, is not the same thing as being a creator. Okay? So you have conflated God's power with the actualization of God's power. So do you understand the difference?
Yeah. Darth, do you have the attribute of speech?
Okay, are you wrong? Are you wrong when you say that God is creator simply because logically prior to creation he possesses power?
Not just power, but the actual
listen. No, you're not understanding. The fact that somebody has the attribute by which would be needed to be creator doesn't make him creator logically prior to creation. Now, I've corrected you several times. If you're not going to concede to something that is so simple to see, there's no point in carrying on, okay? You are simply bickering now. God cannot be the creator logically prior to him instantiating the creator, okay?
In soft immutability, God's core attributes do not change, but God can change with respect to other things. For example, God changes to become the creator. Okay, so prior to creating, he was not creator. So God changes when he creates the world.
Potentiality. So let me ask you: before God created the universe, has he actualized the, what do you want to say, the property or whatever of being a creator before that?
Logically, prior to creation, no.
So the point I'm trying to make to you is that there are certain characteristics have to be actualized, okay? So God is omniscient in eternity past. He has actualization of that, right? God is relational because it's actualized in eternity past for the God of the Bible. But it is not actualized at all. Therefore, the attribute of relational doesn't exist as a characteristic of being personal. So his personalness is lacking until there's creation, and he
are unable to do so because some people out there in our nation don't have maps, and I believe that our education, like such as in South Africa and the Iraq, everywhere like such as, and I believe that they should, our education over here in the U.S. should help the U.S. or should help South Africa and should help the Iraq and the Asian countries, so we will be able to build up our future for our.
Thank you very much, South Carolina. Gary's claim hinges on the idea that from eternity past, God lacked a certain property. First of all, Van Til's creator-creature distinction, which Gary says he holds to and liberally preaches it, says absolutely nothing about the biblical God acquiring an additional property. And this is because under Van Til's framework, creation or being the creator is simply not a property. Rather, and to correct Gary, creation or being the creator is an action. Being the creator is no more of a property than when God, for example, parted the Red Sea or turned water into wine or caused the plagues in Egypt. None of this had anything to do with God acquiring an additional attribute or acquiring an accidental property. Neither Van Til, Banson, Orthodox, mainstream Christianity, or the Bible itself holds to the position or mentions anywhere from Genesis to Revelation what Gary is attempting to advance. The creator-creature distinction has absolutely nothing to do with God gaining or acquiring a so-called accidental property that he lacked from eternity past and then gained in time or at creation. Gary's implication, God creates an accidental property or aspect of himself. This implies that God was incomplete or lacking some part of his essence logically prior to creation. And then God changed his own nature and added to his own essence something that was not previously there. It's very important to point out that Gary would not only say that the Christian God is the only God that possesses this particular set of attributes, but he also says that this set of attributes in its entirety is indivisible, meaning that it cannot be divided or separated into parts, and that all of these attributes make up a character set that Gary sometimes refers to as God's all great making properties, meaning these are properties that would be better for God to possess as opposed to God not having or lacking such a property. Gary's parting his hair on one side analogy works for humans who change over time, but it fails completely when he applies it to God, who is eternal, complete, and unchanging. He's treating God like a human with changeable traits, which is the exact category error he sometimes accuses others of making. If Gary thinks that God either created or acquired his own property, then we could ask him the following. 1. Either affirm that God was already the creator sans creation by virtue of his eternal decree. This, however, would directly contradict his oft-repeated claim that God acquired the property of creator as an accidental attribute at the moment of creation. Or 2, postulate that God created or instantiated some new aspect of himself, some property or relation, in order to become creator even before the creation of the heavens and the earth. But this too is fatally flawed, as it introduces a created fact prior to creation, which is both metaphysically incoherent and biblically unsustainable within the Van Tillian paradigm. Under either option, Gary's formulation collapses. If he affirms the first, he abandons his model of divine acquisition of properties. If he affirms the second, he introduces a form of intra-divine change or temporality, incompatible with classical theism and the immutability of God. Finally, Gary repeatedly asserts that he speaks exclusively from the perspective of the Christian worldview, yet his inconsistent application of creatorhood, fluctuating between essential and accidental categorizations, places his framework outside the bounds of orthodox Van Tillian presuppositionalism. One cannot, within a Christian epistemological framework, both affirm and deny God's eternal creatorhood without violating either the law of non-contradiction or the law of identity. Such equivocation is not merely a semantic oversight, it is a substantive theological error. Gary wants to maintain two positions. If we refer back to Gary's list of core attributes, Gary 1.0 maintains that the God of Scripture possesses a fixed and indivisible set of essential characteristics sans creation, each of which is necessary for the preconditions of intelligibility and therefore as a composite and all-inclusive character set, cannot be manipulated or excluded from God's essence. This core attribute set, according to Gary 1.0, includes characteristics such as omniscience, omnipotence, eternality, aseity, and it also includes the attribute of creator. These attributes, among others, make up God's self-revelatory nature. On the other hand, Gary 2.0 asserts that God acquires the status of creator at the moment of creation, treating creator as an accidental property, a contingent attribute not essential to God's eternal nature. According to Gary 2.0, prior to creation, God is not yet the creator. He only becomes so once the created order exists. This move is philosophically modeled after the Aristotelian Thomistic distinction between essential and accidental properties. Herein lies the fatal inconsistency. If Gary 1.0 affirms that all necessary attributes for intelligibility must be eternally present in the divine nature prior to the existence of anything else, and that this character set is truly indivisible and that intelligibility hinges upon God's complete and unified character set, then it is incoherent to exclude creator from that necessary set. But this is exactly and precisely what Gary 2.0 attempts to accomplish. In summary, Gary's position is self-referentially incoherent. He cannot, on the one hand, claim that all essential divine attributes must exist prior to and independently of creation in order to underwrite intelligibility, and then, on the other hand, exempt the attribute of creator from that list. If God is not the creator from all eternity by decree and essence, then intelligibility, according to Gary's own framework, is not possible until creation occurs. This collapses the presuppositional claim that intelligibility is grounded in the triune God eternally. Gary's failed attempt to reconcile the doctrine of God's immutability with the acquisition of the title creator as an accidental property results in a contradictory metaphysical model. It is inconsistent with the Van Tillian framework is entirely unbiblical and undermines the coherence of divine attributes, and therefore, by its own premises, collapses under its own theological weight. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I now want to shift your attention to another characteristic on Gary's list, the attribute of God being sovereign. What is Gary's view on this particular characteristic? I think some of you theists may be in for another surprise, and some of you unbelievers will again notice Gary's repeated inconsistency and irrationality when handling this attribute. But when we look at this particular attribute, in this case, we are going to need to do a double take, so to speak, once again. And on the surface, Gary F. Milne attempts to sound very Van Tillian in his overall discourse when speaking about God's sovereignty. On multiple occasions, Gary speaks of God's sovereignty as a necessary core attribute. And if you took notes, you have already previously heard Gary include this particular attribute as being one of the 14 core characteristics on his list. In this case, he appears to be in alignment with Van Til. They even have this particular attribute on both of their respective lists. However, when we pull back the curtain again and take a closer look at the man behind it, we will witness Gary once again sharply deviate from the Bible, from Van Til's framework, and from historic Christianity's position on the concept of God's sovereignty. Let's listen as Gary provides us with his so-called Bible-believing, biblical, presuppositional viewpoint.
How so?
Okay, think about it this way. Okay, so if you were saying that well, let me ask you this first. In your Christian worldview, do you believe that God is sovereign in eternity, past, present, and future?
No, God is not sovereign in eternity past. God becomes sovereign the moment he creates.
Oh, okay.
God's sovereignty is not an eternal characteristic.
Okay, in that case, then my rebuttal goes against you.
Yeah, well, these people need to get a life. Anyway, so being relational is not something is potential. You can only be relational if it's actualized. The same thing with being creator. The same thing with being sovereign. Okay? God is not sovereign potentially. Okay? He's only sovereign when it's actualized. Now God is omnipotent from eternity. Okay? But he's not sovereign from eternity. All right, listen. Here's sovereign from, let's say, dictionary.com. A monarch, a king, a queen, okay? A person who has supreme power or authority. Authority over what? You see, the implication is that there are second entities, okay? Says having supreme rank, power, and authority. How can you have a rank when you're the only thing that exists? Okay? How can you have authority over what? What do you have authority over when nothing exists?
Excellent points.
Again, Gary includes God's sovereignty on the list and claims that this is part of an indispensable, indivisible, unique to humanity character set that cannot be changed or manipulated in any way, and that this attribute is one that must already, as a prerequisite, be in place, sans creation, in order for there to be human intelligibility. But Gary talks out of both sides of his mouth whenever he says that God does not become sovereign until Genesis 1. His rationality, as you heard, is that God is not sovereign sans creation, because in order for God to be sovereign, there must be something exterior to God himself. And if not, then the implication is that God cannot yet be sovereign until he instantiates creation.
Yeah, I think you're right about that.
But we can clearly see all the other gods out there are not ultimate, right? And by ultimate, I don't simply mean supreme. To be ultimate means to be eternal, absolute, immutable, unconditionally non-dependent, and the source of everything that is, can be, or cannot be. In other words, everything that exists must derive and depend upon God. And if there's one thing that coexists along God, then God cannot be ultimate. Right?
If there's one thing that coexists.
If there's one thing that were to coexist from eternity with God, then God could not be ultimate. In other words, to be ultimate not only means to be unconditionally non-dependent and the source of all possibility, you have to be sovereign over everything. But if there's something else that coexists from eternity past, he doesn't have control about its existence.
Now, in your, I guess, framework.
From a philosophical theological standpoint, this undermines the traditional doctrine of divine aseity and independence. Sovereignty, like omnipotence or omniscience, is a communicable attribute grounded in God's essential nature, not a role that God performs once a contingent realm exists. Van Til would reject the idea that any divine attribute is actualized in history. He would argue that such reasoning is rooted in autonomous human epistemology. It begins with creaturely temporality and projects it onto God. For Van Til, all of God's attributes are ontologically necessary and eternally actual, not conditionally instantiated by acts within Gary's definition of ultimate includes immutability. Yet the views he holds concerning God's acquisition of creatorhood and sovereignty imply mutability. God becomes something he was not previously. This violates the law of non-contradiction, as God cannot be mutable and immutable in the same respect. To affirm both positions, immutability and acquired roles within the same theological framework, is to affirm a logical contradiction. From a Van Tilian perspective, internal consistency is a necessary condition for any worldview. A worldview that violates the basic laws of logic cannot provide the necessary preconditions for intelligibility. Furthermore, this undermines transcendental argument for God. If the God being argued for is internally inconsistent, then he cannot serve as the necessary precondition for intelligibility. Gary's attempt to combine classical attributes with temporally acquired properties results in an incoherent concept of deity and therefore nullifies his apologetic methodology. Gary affirms that God must be the source of all possibility and impossibility. Yet he simultaneously asserts that God's being acquires certain capacities or roles, creator, sovereign, at the moment of creation. This presents a metaphysical problem. If God is the ground of all possibility, then his nature must define what is possible from all eternity. Therefore, the possibility of his being creator must be grounded in his nature from all eternity. But if his nature did not include creatorhood until creation, then the possibility of creation was not grounded in God's being. That would imply the realm of possibility transcends God, which contradicts Gary's own assertion. Van Til would argue that this approach unintentionally reifies possibility apart from God, which is a hallmark of autonomous reasoning and metaphysical pluralism. For Van Til, possibility is not a realm of truths external to God, but flows from his eternal and necessary character. Gary's statement, though superficially rigorous in affirming God's ultimacy, unravels under closer analysis due to its inconsistency with his other theological commitments. The claim that God is ultimate, immutable, and sovereign is fundamentally incompatible with the view that God becomes creator and sovereign in time. Such a framework violates the creator-creature distinction by making God's nature dependent on his relation to creation, introduces mutability into God, undermining immutability and aseity, relies on temporally conditioned roles, thereby contradicting the necessity and ultimacy Gary attempts to affirm, undermines the transcendental argument, as the concept of God presented cannot function as the necessary precondition for intelligibility. Van Til would likely see this as an instance of autonomous epistemology smuggled into theology, an attempt to define God based not on self-revelation and necessary being, but on observational temporal categories drawn from the creaturely realm. In short, Gary's theological structure, while borrowing terms from classical theism, ultimately amounts to a self-defeating framework that is incompatible with both Van Tilian apologetics and historic Christian doctrine. Now, if you think you've heard just how bad Gary can be, wait till you hear what's next. I am going to let you listen to 2 separate clips, and Gary is a speaker in both. Watch how Gary is inconsistent in his approach and how he plays both sides of the field, maintaining one position in clip A while arguing in a virtually opposite position in clip B.
Claim that he has great making properties?
Like to create?
Does your God possess the quality of love from eternity?
Yeah, of course.
Or does he have to create? Okay, good. Now, being loving is to be other-oriented. It's to be relational and other-oriented. Whom did God love logically prior to creation? How did your God actualize love logically prior to creation?
I don't know anything that happened prior to creation.
Okay, so you don't know that your God is loving logically prior to creation, that he doesn't possess it as an eternal attribute, do you?
No.
Okay, so your God doesn't have all great making properties, okay?
I mean, I don't know that, not that it's incorrect. I just simply don't know the answer.
Well, then there's no quality. Then there's no quality then to invoke if God hasn't revealed it. So your God is not ultimate. He doesn't have all great making properties. Is that a child I hear in the background?
Yes, it is.
You have person includes the aspect of relationality, but the Unitarian conception of God is not maximally personal, nor can he be given the characteristic designation of possessing love. How does God love in eternity past? But you see, with the advent of Jesus Christ and the revelation that God is one God, one being, but within that unity there is a plurality of co-equal persons. Each of the persons is fully relational with the other two logically prior to creation, and each of the persons of the Trinity love the other two logically prior to creation. So in the Trinitarian concept of God, we have a God who is not deficient in terms of great making properties. Okay?
In Gary's critique of Islamic Unitarianism, he correctly applies the principle that a maximally great being must possess the attribute of love eternally and actually. He argues that a Unitarian deity cannot be loving before creation because love requires a subject-object relationship. This is a sound critique grounded in the Augustinian and Anselmian traditions and vindicated by Trinitarianism, which affirms eternal personal love within the Godhead. In contrast, when discussing sovereignty, Gary argues a God was not sovereign sans creation because there was no one to be sovereign over. This statement implies sovereignty is a relational role, not an intrinsic property. It is not eternal and only becomes operative once creation exists. This is a theological double standard. Gary requires that love be eternally actualized to be a valid attribute, but allows sovereignty to be merely potential or contingent. This is philosophically incoherent. Both love and sovereignty are great making properties. If love must be eternally actual, so must sovereignty, or else Gary's critique of the Muslim's God collapses back on the Christian worldview he defends. If Gary's view is granted that God was not sovereign until creation, then the following theological doctrines are violated. A deity God becomes dependent on creation to instantiate one of his core attributes. This introduces passivity into God's nature. B, immutability. God changes from being non-sovereign to sovereign. This introduces temporal mutation into God's essential nature. C, simplicity. If sovereignty emerges as a new part of God's identity, then he is not simple. He becomes composite, composed of essence plus role. D, eternity. God's nature becomes temporally conditioned, contingent on the existence of another, a rejection of timeless divine perfection. E, actus purus. In classical metaphysics, God is pure actuality with no unrealized potential. To say sovereignty was unrealized until creation is to deny this doctrine and introduce potency into God's being, a mark of all created contingent things. Gary claims to operate within the Ventilian apologetic framework. This methodology depends on the idea that the God of the Bible is the necessary precondition of intelligibility. All people know him and are without excuse, Romans 1:18-21. But this claim requires that God's attributes are eternal, necessary, self-contained, aseity, clearly revealed in creation, general revelation. If sovereignty is not eternal, then it is not revealed in creation. It is not part of what people suppress. Unbelievers are not culpable for failing to acknowledge a contingent role. Therefore, Romans 1 collapses under Gary's modified metaphysics. In trying to defend divine love as eternal, Gary has fatally undermined his apologetic foundation by rejecting the eternal sovereignty of God. Conclusion: the integrity of Christian theology and of Ventilian apologetics depends on the metaphysical coherence of God's attributes. A God whose nature changes, whose sovereignty is triggered by creation, is not the God of Scripture, not the God of classical theism, and not the God presupposed in Romans 1. Gary's inconsistency is not minor, it is a fundamental contradiction. He defends God's love as necessarily and eternally actualized while allowing sovereignty to be contingent and potential. In doing so, he compromises the very theology he uses to critique others. To be maximally great, God must be eternally sovereign as well as eternally loving. Anything less is a God of logical convenience, not a God of necessary being. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so this section is going to be the last in this video, but certainly not the least. I'm going to be letting you listen to a few clips, and I think all of them are pretty self-explanatory. I think that most of you who have listened to Gary for even a moderate period of time will have heard from him something along the lines of the next few clips. And these are not isolated incidents, but represent very typical Gary F. Milne.
Well, if God doesn't exist, then something must else exist that provides you with the capacity to be alive, think, and reason. What would that be?
We don't know, and we never will know.
Okay, thank you. That's an honest answer. Now you're going to be blindsided. Okay? So you can reason about God because of I don't know.
Table. Have they always existed?
I believe trees grow because we have the elements on earth for it to grow.
Right. And where did the elements come from? Are they eternal?
Because of the sun and water and our atmosphere.
The elements,
soil.
The elements on the periodic table, have they always existed? Or did they begin to exist?
I don't know.
Okay. So you believe the tree is because of I don't know.
I believe that elements.
As I said before, you are adopting, and you don't want to believe in God. You have made it perfectly clear because of what you just said, and I will quote you. Your worldview comes down to this: everything is what it is because of I don't know. That's what you said. In laws of nature. And if you don't accept that it's a personal absolute that we call God, then it's going to be an impersonal absolute. What would be an impersonal absolute? That's a question I'm going to ask you. No, I don't know. Good. Then if you don't know, then when I tell you, why do you have confidence in testing and reliability? You say, because of I don't know. Because consistency. Well, what secures that consistency? Why are things consistent? Why is there continuity? Why is there uniformity? If you ask me, I'll tell you it's God. It says he upholds all things by the power of his will. Hebrews 1. You say, well, I don't accept your God. Okay, fine. Then tell me what your absolute is. You say, well, I don't know what it is. And if you say, I don't know what's absolute providing for continuity, then what you are doing is you are believing in the reliability and the intelligibility of testing, observation, and repeatability because of I don't know. Ultimately, statement, then your facts have no final or foundational intelligibility. So in other words, it makes no difference whether I say an apple is an apple because of I don't know, which would be unintelligible, versus I give you a chain link of 10 explanations, and then when I get to the 10th answer, I say, well, I don't know. It makes no difference. Both presentations of apples are unintelligible. If you don't know what an ultimate reality is,
We're in the Goldilocks zone.
Hold on a second. When you say laws of nature, you mean that there are certain things that are regular, that there are certain things that are fixed and repeated, that there's continuity and uniformity. What ultimately secures that there can be uniformity and continuity? What is it?
I don't know.
Well, then you just asserted technology because of I don't know.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. So now what you've said is, what you're saying is, if I tell you the moon is filled with green cheese, and you say, how is that the case? And I say, the moon is filled with green cheese because I don't know. Would that be foolish for me to say that?
Next up, M15TTRR3CT4NGL. Thanks for your super chat. They said, Duncan, what did your God do during the infinity before it created everything?
What did my God do sans creation? I couldn't answer that question. It hasn't been revealed.
Thanks so much.
Hey, buddy, you took the papers? Help yourself.
Here you go.
Thanks.
Chicky, you listen to me. You eat too many of those things, you're going to turn into a blimp.
I'll do a hot blimp.
Chicky, are you okay? Chicky? Chicky, are you okay? Chicky? Chicky, what's wrong?
You got a problem?